I want to go on today now into the 1600s. And we're going to talk about a terrible heresy that started around 1640. And it is called Jansenism. There was a bishop named Jansenist. And he was a bishop of, how do you pronounce it? Ypres. And that is a city in what is now Western Belgium, very close to the border with France. A part of Belgium called Flanders. And I believe at that time it was considered part of Holland. But at any rate, he was a bishop of this city, and he worked for years. He worked on a book, and the name of the book was Augustinus, which is the Latin word for Augustine, Saint Augustine. Well, what Bishop Jansenist did was he went back and studied the writings of Saint Augustine, and he wrote a book on grace. So the whole purpose of the book was to describe grace, the functioning of grace in our souls, and so forth. And the question of resisting grace as well. Now, he worked on this for years, and he believed that he had found something in the writings of St. Augustine that was, you might say, hidden or hadn't been correctly taught through the centuries. So here you have the teachings of St. Augustine. The church understood them, more clearly defined them through the councils, added to them, and he didn't accept that. He thought, I'm going to go back to the original source, and I think that that his writings have been misunderstood. And so there's an element of pride there. So here you have all of the theologians of the church and the council saying that this is what St. Augustine teaches, and this is the truth about grace, these various aspects. And he's saying, well, I don't accept that, and I'm going to go back and read St. Augustine's writings and show what I think it is all about. So again, there's that little element of pride. Well, he wrote this book, and he died, I think in 1638. But the book was published 2 years after his death in 1640. Now, when he wrote this book, he said, or wrote, one or the other, he said, I submit my ideas, my writings, to the judgment of the church. So he had that attitude that he submitted and would accept the judgment of the church. Well, he had a friend of his youth, probably when he was in a seminary. And this friend also became a priest and went on to become an abbot. And he was the abbot of a monastery called St. Cyran. C-Y-R-A-N. I don't know if I'm pronouncing Cyran. It was in France. So this man, and I don't know his name, but he was the abbot of that monastery. And he promoted the writings of Jansenist. And there were condemnations. There was a condemnation from the Holy Office of the book and a condemnation of a pope as well. But he didn't accept that. So he began to spread it in France. Now, he was influential with or friends with the superior of a convent near Paris. And it was called a place called Port Royal. And this was a convent. And I think that's the name of the city where it was, but I believe it was fairly close to Paris. At any rate, the mother superior of this convent was a woman named Mère, French for mother, Mère Angélique. And the last name is important. I want to make sure I have it spelled right. Arnauld. Now, this convent, Port Royal, had quite a good reputation because years before, when there was laxity in France, this convent, the sisters there were more conscientious and zealous in living their religious life. But she adopted this from her friend, the abbot of St. Cyran, the writings of Jansenism, and promoted it among her nuns. And their convent was quite well known in France. And it had a lot of friends, a lot of devotees, you might say, to that convent, especially her family, the Arnauld family. And she had a relative, and I don't know if it was a brother, uncle, cousin, what, but his name was Dr. Arnauld. And he especially promoted Jansenism in France. And I'll just read some of this from the book here on Jansenism. By the way, so the church condemned. Pope Innocent X in 1653 condemned 5 propositions taken from the work Augustinus. And this man said, I agree with that condemnation of those 5 propositions, but I deny that they are found in the book. And he says, and the Pope has no authority to tell me they're in the book, but I reject the proposition. So a very fine kind of splitting hairs, trying to get out of being condemned and having to give up his ideas. So I'll just read a little bit. So he made this distinction. This distinction was adopted by most of the Jansenists and enabled them to pose as persecuted and misunderstood victims, since they were willing, they said, to accept all the church taught and to anathematize all that she condemned, refusing only to swear a fact about a particular book, which fact was no matter of divine revelation, so they said, no matter of faith. In spite of all efforts of bishop or pope, the heretics refused either to submit to or openly leave the church. Now, in Holland, which again, Ypres was at that time part of Holland, the Jansenists were excommunicated. But in France, they, so to speak, went under the radar because they were always saying, oh, we accept everything the church says. But Jansenism was a much greater problem in France than anywhere else. It really only was prominent in France and Holland. But again, in Holland, the Jansenists were excommunicated. In France, they tried to pose as just misunderstood, persecuted, and they remained in the church and sowing from within. Now, if you've ever read the life of St. Louis Marie de Montfort, he was constantly being persecuted by Jansenists. But St. Louis de Montfort was a priest. He was ordained in the year 1700, and he died in 1716. So that was less than 50 years after the condemnation of Jansenism by Pope Innocent X. Pope Innocent X condemned the book, condemned these 5 propositions in 1653. So it was very prevalent in France. And we'll get back to that in a minute. But let me read a little bit more of this. It says, in spite of all the efforts of bishop or pope, the heretics refused either to submit or openly leave the church. By continual publications and insidious arguments, they managed to taint even those whom they could not formally corrupt. By artfully playing on the Gallican sentiments of otherwise orthodox divines, means theologians, and by rousing the king's jealousy of papal prerogatives, they managed to hinder the course of papal condemnation, so that while in Holland, the Jansenist leaders being excommunicated went into open schism, and therefore could be fought openly, in France the heretics claimed to be loyal to the church, and even when exposed and expelled, retained such influence over their former associates that scarcely any part of the French remained altogether untouched. So to understand the effect that it had, oh, by the way, I raised the word, the convent in Port Royal. You've probably heard the saying that there was a bishop or cardinal who went and had a visitation, a formal visitation of the convent, and he came away saying, these nuns are pure as angels and proud as devils. Probably heard that. That was the convent, because they would not submit to the authority of the church regarding the condemnation of Jansenism. Now, I mentioned this Dr. Antoine Arnauld. He published a book promoting Jansenism, but the book was primarily on, I think even was a title, was about frequent communion. And he condemned the idea. And not only that, but he was saying one must be almost perfect to be able to go to communion. So even before that book, there were those that didn't go to communion very often. Now they hardly ever went to communion as a result of this Dr. Arnauld's book promoting Jansenism. So he took what was theoretical or theological errors and he put it into practice as far as the reception of communion. So this did a great deal of harm, and people would, again, hardly ever go to communion. Now, the part that I read mentioned, I want to put one other thing up here. So these propositions were condemned by Pope Innocent X in 1653. So the book was published in 1640, and church condemned it formally in 1653. And by the way, in case you're wondering, the 5 propositions, I'll read a couple of them. This gets a little difficult. You know, many years ago, I was probably a seminarian at the time, or a young priest. I read a book called Prayer, the Great Means of Salvation and Perfection by St. Alphonsus Liguori. And it's a wonderful book, but about the first third of the book is on prayer, very devotional, etc. But then he goes into Jansenism and completely condemns it and exposes its errors, etc. But it's quite deep, quite deep. So if anyone reads a book on prayer, you might get to that point and be floundering and thinking, what is he talking about? But St. Alphonsus Liguori was a great doctor of the church who really laid bare the errors of Jansenism. But this is, now what I'm going to read is condemned. This is some of the condemned propositions by the Holy Office and Pope Innocent X. Number 1, some of God's commandments are impossible to just men who wish and strive to keep them. Considering the powers they actually have, the grace by which these commandments may become possible is also wanting. Now, he says some commandments are impossible to human nature without unaided by God's grace. You could say that. But he says that the grace is also sometimes wanting. Here's another error. In the state of fallen nature, no one ever resists interior grace. No one ever resists grace. So you're given an interior grace, you automatically will correspond with it. That was condemned. Here's another one. In the state of fallen nature, to merit or to deserve punishment, we need not be free from interior necessity, but only from exterior constraint. Another one, to say that Christ died or shed his blood for all men is heretical. So that's condemned by the church. You could say that Jansenism was a form of rigorism. And rigorism means you have to do the most, really the most difficult, but the most certain path you have to follow. And someone who's a rigorist will preach a very narrow doctrine or way of how to save one's soul. And it overemphasizes the justice of God and punishment of sin, and neglects to mention or to emphasize the mercy of God. And so this is interesting because Jansenism was condemned in 1653, formally condemned. Finally, it had already been condemned, but the final condemnation of it. Well, when did our Lord appear to St. Margaret Mary? That was in the 1670s. So very shortly after that, the apparitions of the Sacred Heart to St. Margaret Mary and the devotion to the Sacred Heart began to proliferate in the church. So you could see that that's the divine answer, you might say, because Jansenism, again, is a very narrow, rigorous idea of how to get to heaven, overemphasizing the justice of God, the punishment of sin, severity, but neglecting God's mercy and goodness. And so you see the importance of devotion to the Sacred Heart. I want to see if my notes, if there's anything I didn't mention here. Okay. So this Dr. Arnold opposed frequent communion, said that one must be almost perfect to be able to go to communion. Now, I want to mention one more thing about Jansenism. If you notice the part that I read, it said the reason why Jansenism really took a hold in France, and by the way, was a problem in France for about 200 years before it finally died out. But one of the reasons why it was so effective in France is because of what is called Gallicanism. Now, you know that back in Roman times, France was called Gaul, or in Latin, Gallia. So you got that Gall in the Latin word for what we now call France. Most of that was called by the Romans Gaul. So Gallic, ideas are French ideas, all right? It's just a kind of a word for French. Well, Gallicanism was condemned by the church, but it was the idea that the king of France had certain authority even over the church in France, regardless of what the Pope would say. So it was a form of usurping on the part of the royal power, trying to usurp papal prerogatives and papal rights and church rights. It had to do with church property, as well as like appointing bishops and things of that nature. So Gallicanism, which was condemned by the church, was an attempt to limit the rights of the church and ecclesiastical authority, and especially papal prerogatives, in favor of the French government, in the French king. And so because that had already been circulating in France over the previous century, when the church, Pope, I erased it here, but I had Pope Innocent X condemned it, they felt this is like attacking the church in France. And because of their Gallican ideas, they resisted the rights of the Pope and the condemnation of a Jansenism. So again, Jansenism was a rigorous idea, and it was basically, we talked about Calvin, if you remember Calvin, and then after him in Scotland, John Knox, both taught predestination, a false idea of predestination. Jansenists as well, because of their false ideas about grace, had a sort of, had a faulty idea of predestination. And you remember I read one of the ideas that was condemned was that Christ did not die for all men. So he did. All men were redeemed. Not all men are saved, but Christ died for all men. So that was denied by Jansenists. So that is really the main heresy from between the Protestant Reformation up until we get to the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, I want to cover a little bit more leading up to modernism in the 20th century. And this is not so much heresies as, it is, but it's philosophical ideas. In the 1700s and 1800s, there were a lot of philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, Thomas Hobbes, etc. And these philosophers were very anti-clerical, anti-church. You hear that word, anti-clericalism, which just means dislike of, if I spelled that right, anti-clericalism. And it was, this dislike of the church and the authority of the church and the influence of the church. So these philosophers had a lot of influence on people. And one of the things that was popular in the 1700s throughout Europe was the idea, the heretical notion of deism. Now, to understand this, let's first define a couple terms. We know what we mean by atheism and agnosticism. So, atheism says there is no God. The A is kind of like negating, negative. And Theis, or Theos actually, is the Greek word for God. So atheism means denying there's a God. And I remember something that Bishop Fulton Sheen said in one of his talks. He said in the United States, this time that he was talking, there are probably about 100 pure atheists, meaning 100 persons who deny God and believe, at least, that in their mind they've reasoned to that. But he said there are thousands of practical atheists, which means they deny there is a God because they don't want there to be a God. Because if there is, they have to obey his laws. So he referred to it as practical atheism, where they know there's a God, but they say there is no God because they don't want there to be a God. So atheists claim that they have reasoned to the conclusion that there is no God. But again, for the most part, they don't want there to be a God, because that would interrupt the way they want to live. St. Thomas Aquinas is one who wrote extensively on the proofs for the existence of God from reason. We look at the order of the universe, the beauty, the harmony, and think, how could this have just developed out of chaos and just haphazardly? There are many proofs like that we could go into some other time. But proofs for the existence of God. So an atheist denies there is a God. An agnostic, on the other hand, says there probably is a God, but I can't know him. This comes from the word, you remember we talked about Gnosticism, which is a Manichaeism, which in the Middle Ages was like the Jansenism. They claim to not know, to not be able to know anything about God. So an agnostic lives like an atheist. He has no religion, no reverence for God. He says, well, there probably is a God, but it's impossible for me to come to knowledge of anything about him, so therefore I'll just pretend like he doesn't exist. Now, the deists, and I don't know who first started this, they kind of come from that agnostic mentality. The deists say there is a God, and he created the world, but he has nothing more to do with it. Like he created us, and he left us on our own, and it just basically abandoned the world. So it's a denial of the providence of God, and also a denial of our duty as creatures to worship God, etc. And I mentioned deism because many of the founding fathers of this country were deists. That was their thinking at that time. They're very, very prominent, very popular among the so-called learned classes at that time in the 1700s, mid-1700s, deism. So those are just several ideas that were circulating. And again, there were these anti-clerical philosophers who had a lot of influence on people. Now, another thing we find especially in the 19th century, was rationalism. And rationalism is the idea, it comes to the word ratio, is the word for reason. Okay, rationalism is, I won't believe anything unless I can understand it and prove it by my reason. Otherwise, I reject it. So in effect, rationalists believe that miracles are impossible, because a miracle is something contrary to nature or above nature. So rationalists reject miracles, and they, in effect, are like practical atheists. But it's interesting that Our Lady appeared to St. Bernadette in 1858 at a time when France was very much materialistic and rationalistic. The results of the French Revolution, which was, the French Revolution was started from Freemasonic principles, liberty, equality, fraternity, and very anti-Catholic, anti-clerical, and rationalism was a big part of it. So I wanted to mention that. Now these all of these ideas coalesced in the mid to late 1800s into what the church calls liberalism. And the great foe of liberalism was Pope Pius IX. And I want to just introduce it. And in our next class, which by the way will be 3 weeks from today, because with Easter and Easter break, we'll wait till the week after the Easter octave is over. I want to talk about that more because Pope Pius IX condemned various ideas of liberalism. And then, to top it off, he came out with a condensed form of all their errors, and it was called the Syllabus of Errors. And I will talk about some of those more later. But liberalism was basically from the mid-19th century up until the beginning of the 20th century, the latter part of the 19th century, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, etc. And then from this came modernism. So modernism was the outcome of the liberal ideas. There's a very interesting book on liberalism. As a matter of fact, they got plenty of copies over here. Just show you one. Because we've used this in the seminary before. I really like this book. It's called Liberalism is a Sin. And what's really interesting about this book is that it was written in Spain by this priest in 1860s or 1870s, thereabouts. And he condemns liberalism completely. Really well done. Really exposes the errors of liberalism. And another priest thought this book is terrible. He's sowing division, etc. So this priest sent it to Rome, to the Holy Office, asking that it be examined and then condemned, because he thought he was, doing the devil's work, because he's so strong, condemning liberalism. Well, it was examined by these theologians in Rome, and then they wrote back to that priest and said, this is exactly what the Pope has said. This book is fantastic, and you are to keep silence about, condemning it, and it is to be promoted, etc. And the author of this book is to be commended. But if you've never read it, this really would be a good book to read. Liberalism is Sin by Father Felix Sarda y Salvani. And this is, of course, an English translation and adapted for our country. There are a couple things that I think the priest or the person who translated it either mistranslate correctly or leaves out, but for the most part, it's outstanding. So liberalism, latter half of the 19th century, and then that led into modernism. So next class, we're going to cover liberalism in more detail, and then go into modernism.